surrounding that cost element, or those cost elements that you can add up. You need to include the risk events that have a corresponding cost impact. Calculations for multiplicative effects, correlation between cost components, and it has to include logic to avoid impossible slices in your simulation, because this cost risk model is going to be subject to, most likely, a Monte Carlo simulation that in effect rehearses the project many thousands of times. But you don't want situations that could appear in a particular slice of that model that logically can't occur. Maybe the selection of a supplier, for example. If you're only selecting one supplier, you're for a particular element to the project, then you don't want a scenario where in a particular slice of the cost risk model, you've got two suppliers appearing. So here's a sort of a crude example to try and sort of explain what the first pass and second pass development of cost risk model is all about. So here's an example where we've got a defence supplier bidding for a prime role to design and build a fleet of vehicles for the Ministry of Defence. This is completely fictitious. The main subcontractor is not yet chosen. And the actual price information here is irrelevant to all intents and purposes. The principle that I'm getting at here. So you can see two suppliers, one US, one in Europe, and obviously you've got variability in exchange rates that need to be taken into account. And that's the breakdown at a high level of the other cost components that can crudely be added up. So in that instance, there's a deterministic baseline cost of a figure. The figure's really quite irrelevant. So the first pass model is for each of those major cost components that you could add up. We've captured an optimistic and a pessimistic estimate for each. So worst case and best case. And you would have more detail to try and justify those figures. So you would capture that for each cost element that you can add up. And you would subject that to, well, you could basically plot that cumulatively on a graph. And hey presto. The angle of the curve, not curve, the straight line, is basically an expression of how uncertain you are around that particular cost component. So what does that graph tell you? Well, there's a number of things. Supplier choice is critical and requires more detail. Well, the reason for that is it's cumulative, but the supplier cost is basically taking the cost in terms of best case from here out to here, and worst case from here out to here. So there's massive uncertainty surrounding that supplier cost. So that's why observation from that first pass model is supplier choice is critical and requires more detail. So in terms of informing the second pass model, you may well focus in a bit more detail on that supplier choice. In terms of proceeding to second pass, now the cost elements that can be summed are the supplier price, and there's a number of risks that could occur that could influence that as well that need to be captured in the model, which I've just captured there for summary purposes. I mentioned mutually exclusive situations, and in this instance, an obvious one. You can only choose one supplier, although there's an intent. Now, in terms of a structure, now you can make this much prettier, but just very crudely, at the top there you can see supplier A, and there's a price, and it's a firm price, so there's no, in terms of a minimum, most likely a maximum cost for that, there's no uncertainty. These are the two risks that were referred to on the previous slide. In that instance, it's got a probability of 60% and that a probability of 20%. And they've each got 3-point estimates. and it's rational to add those up. I haven't included correlation in here. You would do. And exchange rate as well, which is captured there. And there's a supplier B option added there as well, which captures all the information associated with supplier B. So the output from that, in terms of the output from the model, is sort of captured over in this column here. So each time the model simulation is run, these figures will change. So these risks will either fire off or they won't, because there's 60% or 20% of occurrence. These figures, these simulation cost figures will change and appear either between that 20 or that 490. And the outcome, I mean, in this case, it's 0 because the risk hasn't occurred, crudely. So those all add up, and then there's an exchange rate to take into account. So in this particular slice of the model, that's the supplier A total, and that's the supplier B total. And it's not that an elegant sort of a means of avoiding the mutually exclusive scenario, but in this instance, there's 30% probability of choosing company A and 70% of choosing B. So that would have a corresponding impact on the contracted price as well. And those are the remaining additional items that you could include. But that's not the end of it. That's just the next step. You would then mature your understanding in terms of correlation between various cost components. So down here, for example, if development costs have a tendency to err towards the worst case estimate, if you've got a strong correlation between development costs and trial costs, then it would tend to the right-hand side as well. And that's the sort of effect that you would see. So the output from that first pass model is the straight line, quite crude, based on worst case estimates and best case estimates. The output from the Monte Carlo simulation, the model that you just see in that Excel spreadsheet, is an S-curve that you would see. And in this instance, because there isn't a lot of kind of correlation information in there, some of the observations, less risk than the first pass. Now, you can see that because the steepness of the curve is steeper on the Monte Carlo simulation. So there's more uncertainty, there's less uncertainty. Key drivers, material fluctuation, exchange rate. You would carry out sort of sensitivity analysis as well on that to determine things like this. Potentially dramatic effects. 80% confidence in the first pass that the cost would be 12.3 million and second pass 11.2. Well, that's quite a percentage difference. But again, it's iterative. You would repeat. Second pass, yes, more detailed, is more representative. It's not ideal because there's no correlation, and you would continue the process of developing and maturing that model. Now, in terms of improving the quality of inputs that go into that model, or any cost risk model, there's a number of things that you could do. In terms of improving the quality of risk information that goes into that model, as I mentioned towards the beginning, risk descriptions are quite critical. And some commonly used formula and approaches for capturing risk information are not necessarily that good and may well lead to the very large risk registers. So if then and there is a risk that is a very common formula that's used to describe a risk. But it can lead to very large, sort of atomized, detailed risk registers. So a recommended structure around the improving the quality of risk information that goes into your cost risk model is using 3-form description. Context around the risk, the sources of uncertainty, and the impact. Now, the benefit of capturing the separate sources of uncertainty for a given risk is that it makes it easier to understand the multiplicative effects of how those sources of uncertainty could combine and have a a significant impact. So here's an example. Context. It is planned that the power distribution system will be delivered in May 2015. Procurement strategy is by competitive tender. The impact delayed to the commencement of electrical system integration. This moves away slightly from this sort of traditional view of there is a risk that such and such a thing could occur and it will have this impact. It starts to capture all of the things that you're uncertain about for a particular risk area. And it helps when it comes to mitigation actions as well, because avoid mitigation actions can be focused in on the source of the risk facts. So, for example, procurement strategy is by competitive tender. You might be able to mitigate that risk dramatically by not competing. That might not be correct, but other inputs. Better quality estimates. For every single line item in that cost risk model, there will be a 3-point estimate carried out, a worst case estimate, a best case, and a most likely. And naturally, we're quite generally not very good at estimating the worst case scenarios because we don't capture and consider how all those sources of uncertainty can combine. There are a number of mental shortcuts called heuristics that we carry out when making estimates. So if you're presented with a deterministic cost for a particular cost element, for example, you would be naturally distracted by that cost when carrying out a worst case cost for that particular task. And that's a sort of a mental shortcut where people can't often see that a cost might triple, for example, for whatever reason. Multiplicative effects. I've mentioned them a few times, but just a very quick example. The vehicle that we're in the project that we're referring to, a number of the cables require triple screening for EMC purposes. There's a baseline estimate, as you can see there, 100 cables per vehicle, £100,000 per vehicle for all the cabling. So for the fleet of vehicles, you're looking at £10 million. Now, if you were to use the traditional plus or minus 10% model of considering what is appropriate for risk contingency, that would give you a fleet spread of between 9 and 11 million. But this is where you need to sort of investigate, well, what are we uncertain about this scenario? And as a consequence of, in this particular example, there is uncertainty around the number of cables per vehicle. There's uncertainty around the percentage of cables that might need screening. And there's uncertainty about the average cost as well. And you can see how all of those multiplicative effects can combine. So using the figures there, worst case estimate could be £270,000 per vehicle, not 100. Best case could be £56 per vehicle, £56,000 per vehicle. So you can see the spread change there for the fleet cost. It's gone from 9 to 11 million to 5.6 to 27 million. Now everyone, you look at that 27 million pounds and people will think, oh, it can't possibly be that much. And yes, it's exceptionally highly unlikely, but given all the sources of uncertainty, it is a possibility and therefore needs to be captured in your risk model. Improve 3-point estimates, and there's just a sequence of good practice here. Get your risk description right. Oh, is that overwritten? Brilliant. Make the worst case estimate first. And if you're the person trying to get the estimate out of an individual, don't give them the deterministic estimate because they'll be drawn to that. Best case next, and then most likely. And importantly, document the evidence as well. Risk ownership. I mentioned it much earlier on, but there's two aspects to risk ownership. Who is the risk owner of a risk, and who is the risk-bearing organisation? And it may well be separate bodies. It may well be separate individuals. It helps to capture that understanding in your risk register to avoid that scenario where the risk-bearing organisation risks appear in your price. So when you're being investigated, they're just taken out. So some key learning points from the slides. Recommendation is to use an iterative approach and a top-down approach. And importantly, as mentioned, capturing justification for all the model design inputs. And it's all focused on developing a cost risk model that represents how the project will behave in reality. So avoid those scenarios where you're just summing the weighted parts of your risk register. It takes time to get right, and we need to plan for it. Unfortunately, we don't. Any questions? Well, thank you very much. Oh, yeah.
You talked about schedule risk analysis being an input to the cost risk analysis.
Yes.
I should you kind of say a little bit more about the detail of that, how you go about it?
Well, the schedule risk analysis.
Well, how you go from one to the other.
Well, you could take your schedule risk model and that would provide a spread of the likely completion date of your project. Now, as a first pass, or maybe a second pass in your development of a cost risk model, you may well simplistically assign an average cost per month for running the project. That might not be appropriate and might not be rational, but as a first or second pass, you would assign that to your cost risk model as a cost element that would cost X pounds per month, and it's got this level of uncertainty surrounding it. So it'd just be another additive cost line item. Got to be careful that you don't duplicate cost when doing that, though, that it's not captured elsewhere in your uncertainty estimate. So say, for example, you had a design element in your cost risk model. The uncertainty surrounding that cost estimate for that design element could include schedule delay cost implications as well. So you've got to tread carefully. That's why it's important to capture the basis and how the schedule risk model output is going to be used. No?
You mentioned using three-point estimates, for example, there. A lot of the math or arithmetic you should help the analyst to do more with actually summing arithmetically as opposed to summing statistically, to use the Monte Carlo simulation. Do you think you would go to the trouble of developing three-point estimates and probabilising things and then not running the Monte Carlo simulation, or do you think that just adding arithmetic is an acceptable way to do it?
I haven't done anything that's there was a Monte Carlo simulation behind those figures. Well, I didn't do the simulation, but in order to produce that S curve, a Monte Carlo simulation would be carried out on that cost risk model.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
How do you see this particular principle actually? Is it growing? Is it being more and more recognized? Curious? Is it being implemented more and more in big projects?
The principle of carrying out quantitative risk analysis to determine risk budgets is increasing, yes. In the vast majority of cases that I come across, it's often the weighted sum of the parts cost risk model that is used to determine the risk budget. In terms of like help a number of organisations to around this area in terms of helping them to develop better prices, better informed prices. So certainly when I go round to a particular organisation, it's the way in which I advise them to follow. I don't think there's any sort of natural trend for people to be adopting this. There's an education element to it. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you learned a few things.